We will get plenty of noise though, because there is a big element that has a media following that will want to have a crack and will continue to virtue signal and speak in terms of moral superiority. But it is noise.
Politics and Irish agriculture. Is it a happy marriage or a rocky relationship that might be headed for the divorce courts in 2023? Hello and welcome to a new podcast series, AgriFocus, where we go beyond the headlines and take a closer look at a critical issue for Irish agriculture. This week it's politics both at home and further afield. I'm Francess McDonnell and I'm joined today by Ciaran Fitzgerald, who's a food economist with more than 30 years experience in the agri-food sector and of course a regular columnist here at Agriland. Today we're going to be talking about a subject that's unavoidable, politics. So Ciaran, there's no date set for the big day yet. You believe there's already election fever in the air.
Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that we've seen the start of the electioneering for the next election. It might be, 18 months out, but it started. And while there was some focus on the recent supposed alleged stroke by Fine Gael, talking about tax cuts, what we're seeing on the agriculture and food side is elements of the Green Party and the Socialists all having a cut at agriculture. And I think we have to recognise that there'll be plenty more to come, that there is an electorate apparently out there that is being appealed to by Green Party acolytes and others that, have an appetite for this very binary, very dismissive view of agriculture. So that, as we've seen over the last 3 years, there's been a particular onslaught with regard to the communication about what agriculture is and isn't. A lot of it has been incredibly negative. At the core of it is a notion that says that you must suppress Irish agricultural output to achieve not only Irish, but, global reductions in emissions, which is absolute nonsense. So what I'd be suggesting is that we all need to sort of hold our breath and refrain from responding to the noise and try and remain focused on the signal. And I think that's, it can be hard to do, but if you look at what's happened in the last 3 years, as well as all the noise and all the ballyhoo, that's been hard to take because I suppose what the only consistency is that the general level of ignorance about climate change is the same as the general level of ignorance in these statements about agriculture. The signal with regard to the decarbonisation of our economy and the decarbonisation in particular of the agricultural parts of the economy are around the food-wise process. They are around the budgets. So I think we should try and stay focused on that. What I would also say is that, it has to be concerning, particularly with, you have a Green Party that's in government. The noise and the anti-agricultural trope, I would suggest, is likely to have the opposite effect in terms of decarbonisation.
I was going to say to you, we're always told politics is local, but in this case, politics isn't really local because we're talking about European politics, which filter down into what we're hearing in the Dáil, in the Seanad. But then we're also talking about what people are saying in different communities. We were down in Roscommon not so long ago. People there are talking about how they're not listened to by some politicians in the Dáil. So the whole political mix at the moment is very confused.
I wouldn't say it's European. I think it's very Irish. I think it's very small island. I think there is an almost narcissistic view by people in elements of the political system that would like to confine the global discussion on climate change to being one about livestock and livestock production. And that's just nonsense. That is small island. I participate and I'm involved in and read a lot about European politics and global politics. And I think what everybody there understands is that first and foremost, in terms of decarbonising our economies, we have to look at fossil fuels and we also have to look in the broad sense at other emitters of carbon. We all get that. In Ireland, we have this small island nonsense that tries to put livestock production at the heart of it. And when you dig down into that, an awful lot. First, there's the bit about the tribalism, because I think it's very important. If I was trying to introduce change management in a company, I wouldn't bring the people in and say, you've been working very foolishly and very stupidly for the last 20 years. You're actually doing more damage than good. things are going to change. How do you get buy-in for that? How do you get implementation of change? So anybody who's run a business or involved in anything realistic in the last 20 years knows that if you want change, you must bring people with you. This is not based on bringing people with you. This is based on tribal moral superiority stuff.
But why is there this obsession now about livestock?
Because, as I said, it's a small island thing. I mean, if you take a step back 30 years ago to when the Paris Accord and the Kyoto Protocol were being put together, there was, on the one hand, skepticism that, climate change was human-driven and therefore the need to people to buy into the science. But there was an identification at that time that, since the Industrial Revolution, with what had taken place first in Great Britain at that time, etc., and then moved on to the USA and then China, industrialization had always involved fossil fuels. And if you continue to see the world industrializing and using and burning up fossil fuels, the climate was going to deteriorate quite dramatically. Now, in the identification of sources of carbon, it was identified that, there are issues around methane and animal production. What's happened is that out of the Kyoto Protocol and other agreements have come what are these IPPC accounting methods, which are very deep and very complex. But in that, so on the one hand, if you look at the history since the Industrial Revolution, and as we were all taught in the 60s and 70s, like Ireland was a relatively poor country because we'd no coal, steel, oil or gas. And yet when it came to the putting together of budgets, the countries that had used coal, steel and gas were all given credits for the fact that they stopped using them. And when the IPPC accounts were put together, what you found that Ireland, had no emissions coming from what had been the industrial development of that time, but had emissions coming from agriculture. So agriculture in accounting terms is up there at 27 to 37%, hence the focus. That has been the focus. Now, in the broader world, the methane piece and the food development piece is understood. And in the Paris Accord, it specifically says that measures to reduce emissions must not interfere with food production. It very specifically says that. What we've had is a rant here for the last 3 years that basically is about this small island syndrome that says, it's virtue signaling, it's moral superiority, we must be the first, we must be the best.
And who would you blame for that?
Well, it's not a question of blame. It's a question of, as I said, looking at that and saying, there's a political view and there's a certain wokeism and there's also a certain media view of the world that's quite shrill, that wants to see, and I've described it as, for all the poor devils stuck on the M50 for an hour and a half each evening. Apparently there's an appetite for this sort of tribal row where you get somebody on from agriculture, somebody on from the Green Party or something else, and you have a row and the people in the M50 feel, geez, that's a half an hour gone, that's great, I'm nearly home. Now that sounds very supercilious, but it's not far off the mark. So my point, I think, is we need to decarbonise and we need to reduce our environmental impact. We will only do that through cooperation, through buy-in from the actual producers. And I suppose part of why we are where we are with agriculture, this vilification procedure is, everybody has an opinion on how food should be produced. There has long been a Green Party view, for instance, that we should never eat food that we don't produce within 50 miles, and that the Irish food industry is guilty of exporting 90% of its products. The facts are in dairy and beef, dairy in particular, we produce enough dairy products for about 45 million people. That is placed as being, a problem, a challenge and an issue. So it comes from that view of where food should be produced. And, in lots of ways, that's fine. Knock yourself out, believe that. But don't try and twist that into a situation where you're saying, and therefore we must stop livestock production in Ireland, because that is not going to, first of all, you're not going to get buy-in, which is very important. Do you actually want to see a reduction in carbon emissions? If the answer is yes, well, then get people on board. Don't slate them and insult them and patronise them. And the other piece you have to recognise is the specifics around food production. That it's you're not achieving much in global terms if the world starves
Yeah, and what about the economics of it, of how important it is to rural communities then?
Well, it's very important to the Irish economy. And again, I've written about this in a number of articles. We have an accounting issue with regard to what's important in the Irish economy. And most of the time we know this. So there's a GDP figure produced every quarter or every year, and everybody says, well, it's not real, because when you take out the multinational...
it's an inflationary, or it's sort of an imaginary figure.
It is an imaginary figure. And according to Eurostat officially, the difference between the real and the imaginary is 200 billion euro. So it's quite big. But in that imaginary figure, agriculture is done down, because if you divide agriculture's contribution by 430 billion, the imaginary figure, you get a small contribution. But if you divide agriculture's contribution by the much smaller 200 billion, and you also look at agriculture's spend in the Irish economy, what you get is a verified situation that the food and drink sector and the agricultural sector combined are the biggest single spenders in the Irish economy. So there's a survey done, which, maybe not a lot of people read this, but survey done every year by Enterprise Ireland and other state agencies that measures expenditure in the Irish economy. So what you're always trying to do is look at multinational transactions and say, well, what actually drives the Irish economy? So if you look at Irish economy footprint, the food and drink sector has almost a 20 billion euro footprint. Now, the whole of industry has a 55 billion euro footprint.
So majorly significant. Hugely
significant. And unique in lots of ways, because we happen to have this situation where, it is great that we have foreign direct investment, and it's great that we have a pipeline. But there are limited geographical areas where that takes place for lots of reasons around infrastructure and access to airports and other stuff. We happen to have a big concentration around the Dublin area, a big concentration in parts of Cork, and then in parts, Galway and the west of Ireland. So it is not universal, whereas the food industry and the agricultural sector is deeply based.
And we also know there is that multiplier effect. So
Absolutely.
For every euro spent in that sector, we know that it's multiplying within communities, within our national economy.
Yeah, it's spent at least twice. So again, not to be blind on everybody with figures in detail, but the CSO figures would say that for every euro spent, there's 2 euros spent in the local economy. So if you take the dairy sector, whose spend in the Irish economy has gone from 1.5 billion to 5 billion since quotas went. I mean, a huge contribution. That is the equivalent of 10 billion euros spent in the Irish economy, because it's transacted internally. There's a big multiplier effect, and that makes a huge and unique contribution. And I think that's another part of the challenge, because the dismissiveness of agriculture will say, on the one hand, there's this, look at the environmental impact, blah, blah, blah. And on the other hand is, and look, it's only 1% of GDP. We wouldn't miss it if it was gone. And that is, one of the more crazy elements of this discussion. And, when you look at this multiplier and you look at the fact that there were 220,000 jobs associated right across from farming through food manufacturing, distribution, marketing, etc. That's 1 job in 10 almost in the Irish economy. It won't be replaced easily. As I point out in my recent article, like if you're trying to, identify the signal from all this noise, one of the real signals in terms of why the food industry and agricultural sector will thrive is that there is huge global demand for what we in Ireland produce. And we're in a far better situation than if we had all these local admirers, God help us, but we didn't have a market. We have a huge market. There's a huge demand. It's based, perversely, when you think of the Irish noise, on the fact that we have a grass-based meat and dairy offering that global customers and consumers want in across 110 countries.
And we saw that in China, because our correspondent was in, Breffney O'Brien was in China recently with the Minister for Agriculture, Charlie McConnell, and he was selling Ireland very strongly. And it is that whole green gold aspect, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And it's, it's both verifiable and it is ultimately sustainable and renewable. And across even you go back 4 or 5 years ago when we got back into, so after the recession, there was a period during the recession where the view that we needed to decarbonize was put on hold because the economies were trying to recover. But, around about 5 or 6 years ago, you saw a lot of noise around European countries. Holland is one in particular where they were trying to introduce elements of their dairy production that were grass-based. And the scheme at the time introduced was that they were trying to convince farmers to put animals onto grass for at least 3 months of the year. So, there's a recognition that grass-based is natural, that it's sustainable. In Ireland's case, because the grass grows for a relatively long period, we get 9 months or more maybe, it is economically sustainable as well as being environmentally sustainable. And the demand for that is both authentic and real. And it also, in reality, feeds into the fact that global demand for dairy is increasing quite significantly. And if that dairy supply doesn't come from Ireland, it will come from areas of the world that don't have sustainable production. And the WHO, the World Health Organization, and the World Food Organization did a piece of work last year to show that if European agriculture and European dairy output is suppressed because of climate targets, and you get the same in New Zealand and elsewhere, well, the demand will have to be met. The demand for dairy products will have to be met, but it will come from Pakistan and India, where emissions are 20 times higher than they are here.
So it is a balancing act.
It is a balancing act. And I think it has taken 15, 20 years or whatever the figure is, to move the general public to a situation where we accept the science and we get it. I think my concern would be that implementation of decarbonisation is not based on science. There's too many kites being flown, too many prejudices involved and too many biases, and with great respect, I think there's a big vegan element to the attitude to food production. There's been significant attempts to try and prove, if that's the right word, that, meat and livestock aren't legitimate products because of the carbon piece. And that misses out, in reality, the fact that, demand for food is based on nutrition first, taste, provenance, and other things. So you can't replace this with sort of an ideological view that says, well, plant-based is best, et cetera, et cetera.
But there is an argument about food security in Ireland too, that we do need to have food security. So our plans and our climate targets need to be in balance with what we need to be able to produce, and because our export markets are so important to the economy. So do you think there is a plan there that has common ground? Well,
I think food-wise, again, I make the point, if you stick to the signal rather than the noise, I think food-wise has a balanced view. And I think in overall terms, there is this balanced view. But there is no doubt that there has been a stridency in terms of the commentary that has been quite dismissive of things like food security and quite dismissive about, all of those issues around balance that needs to, if you like, stand back and look at what's being implemented. What are you trying to do here? What's the end game? How do you get people buy-in? We sit in a European market that is a single market, and the balance is to be found there. We trade outward with a lot of countries in terms of our meat and dairy products, and we buy in fruit and veg. I think the other piece that's missing at times from the shrill debate is the supply of grocery products in Ireland is decided by 4 retailers or 5.
There's a monopoly there in the market, isn't there?
They decide what's on the shelves. So all this wishfulness about fruit and veg, the dominant buying capability of the bigger retailers basically diminished the capability of local suppliers of fruit and veg to stay in business in Ireland. And not just in Ireland, right across Europe. There is no doubt about that. The squeeze in terms of everyday low pricing was not sustainable. So that's why we don't produce fruit and veg. It's not a lack of foresight. Again, when we talk about food, and again, when we talk about this question of balance and reality, you have to understand what controls the grocery market. And on that basis, there needs also, I would suggest, to be a look at the impact of buying power. because buying power, it's a 20th century phenomenon. It's not fit for the 21st century. And if buying power continues in the way it's going, you'll get less and less food being produced in a European model because the price is not sustainable.
And just coming back, and finally now, we started talking about politics. Do you think this is going to be a major issue in the next election?
I think it will be, and I think there are important parts of that, because it's no harm that we get to articulate, if there is a balance in the debate, the importance of the agricultural sector, and to show that agriculture in 2023 has moved on quite dramatically, even from agriculture in 2019. So, the I suppose, hypocrisy piece of this, agriculture is probably the only part of the economy that is implementing a decarbonisation program that has actually not just got, targets that are out there, but has measures that are reducing carbon and addressing its impact. That needs to be recognised. We will get plenty of noise, though, because there is a big element that has a media following that will want to have a crack and will continue to virtue signal and speak in terms of moral superiority. But it is noise.
Well, thank you for listening. We'd love to hear your feedback on whether you have any views in this. And I'd just like to thank Ciaran Fitzgerald for joining us today. Goodbye.